Hello everyone and welcome. My name is James Harding. I am the editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and this evening's subject is probably closer to my heart than most and more in keeping with what we've trying to do ever since we set up Tortoise, which is take the stories that are breaking around us and try and make some sense of them. So we got going as a newsroom. We went live in April of last year, and in a number of think-ins, we've come back to the same question about how do we treat our history. We held a think-in that my colleague Arif Akbar hosted on the decolonization of culture and museums. This week, on Thursday, we're holding a whole summit on education. But a few months ago, we commissioned a piece on the future of antiquity. And it was an attempt to try and understand the forces that are reshaping the way in which we think about the past. And since then, of course, we've seen the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protests, and a really searching debate about the way, not just the UK, but in this context, let's focus on the UK, thinks about the history it chooses and the history it chooses to forget, or at least neglect. And so what we wanted to do this evening was try and open up for a real editorial meeting, a real discussion. My colleague Liz Mosley, who's a fellow editor and partner at Tortoise and is trying to corral the conversation in the chat. Hello, Liz. We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about what we needed to get right in our think-ins. And one of the points we were making was we need to get away from performance listening and to the kind of conversation where we're really going to use this next hour to inform the journalism that comes out of it. So we've plugged in for a few weeks from now, a week where we're going to run a series of pieces on the future of history. And what we want to use this hour to do is treat it, if you like, as somewhere between an editorial meeting and a planning meeting, a discussion of how do you tackle that subject? What are the areas of it that are really key to helping people understand how they might rediscover or return to history in a way that is more thorough, provides more context, gives a greater understanding of what happened in the past in a way that's constructive to thinking about today. And we want to hear from everyone. We're really lucky that the sort of two people we've got who I hope will help get us started on this. Luke Pepera, who's a historian, hello Luke, is a historian actually focused on pre-colonial Africa, but I hope will really help us weigh in and think about how we are getting our history right and wrong. And then Professor Kate Williams, Professor of History at Reading, and also critically, who's in this sort of perfect metaphor for the issue we've got, I think, has handed over, am I right, Kate, your Twitter handle to Luke. So there's a whole question of who holds the pen in the writing of history that you're a sort of perfect case study for. And we'll talk a bit about that. But the key thing to say about a think-in, and forgive this overlong introduction, the reason I'm laboring the point is the key thing is that this is like a very large editorial meeting where we will get better informed by hearing from as many people as possible. So Liz is going to try and make sure that the points you make in the chat get woven into the discussion. If you're new to Zoom, which is unlikely given that we spent the last 3 months mostly on it, but if you're new to Zoom, do know that you can hit the participants tab and there's a little gray box that comes up and you can say raise hand, and then I'll see your digital blue hand and I'll bring you into the conversation. But we've got one rule to think in, which is notwithstanding the sort of heft and intellect of Luke and Kate, we don't want people asking questions. We really want to hear your point of view, your expertise, your perspective on things. So we've got one simple rule: no questions. Tell us what you think. And with that, Luke, why don't we start with you? Tell us what you think. If you were crafting a week of journalism to think about the future of history, how would you approach it? What would you include? What would you think are sort of dead ends and wastes of time? How would you approach it?
Well, I think the first thing when you're thinking about history and talking about history, especially of a particular country, is to look at the people that are currently within it. I mean, what I think and what I believe is that especially nowadays, I mean, we can't really talk about, as sometimes anthropologists would say, us and them. There is only us. I mean, there is so much mixing and multiculturalism, etc., in the society, and especially in a society like Britain, whose history involves a lot of, pioneering, seafaring individuals who went to these different places, interacted with different tribes, etc., and people who also came here both during that time and in more recent times. So I think if you're talking about, if I was going to do something in that vein on the history of a place like Britain, I would have to take into account, or I think one would have to take into account, all the people that currently live here. How did they get here? How do they interact? And how did they interact with the English or the British, whoever of the past? Why is that important? And why does that make Britain the place that it is today, and quite a unique place as well?
And look, I suppose what we're dealing with here is that there's a favoritism in history, right? And there's a favoritism for certain stories. There's a reason that people joke about Henry VIII, right? That everyone chooses to tell the stories of the Tudors. Do you think the answer to that, if you were reimagining the way in which a country learns its history, is that you do something that's much more sequential, that you allocate the same periods of time to the same periods of history? Is it more geographical? Is it more directly related to the issues of your times and the population of your country as it stands? I mean, I'm not sure that I like any of those as an approach, but I'm just really interested to know how you think you would guide people to rethink the future of history.
That's a good question. I think, funnily enough as well, I actually think that the studying of someone like Henry VIII, at least in the English context and in English history, is important, because that is, it's the actions under Henry VIII, Act of Supremacy, etc., in 1536. I mean, all stuff which I learned at school and still remember, which formed the foundation of, the church, the Church of England that we have today. So things like that, I think, are important to know, perhaps not so much of the other detail. But I mean, it's a difficult question. What I feel you don't want to do is perhaps focus, you have to, it's almost like quite a precarious balancing act. You don't want to go too deep, I don't think personally, into, let's say, even some of the topics I was studying today. I mean, I don't understand why a British child, unless it's someone who's interested in history as a whole, would want to look at, let's say, the economy of the Malian Empire and, in a certain period. Right. But they would be interested, I think, even as a Ghanaian, I'm very, very interested, let's say, in the British Anglo-Ashanti Wars, in things like the slave trade. How did my ancestors, not only encounter Britain and vice versa, but also what does that mean for these societies today? For Britain as well, for the culture, this culture, which I am a part of, and also for the Ghanaian society and culture, of which I'm also a part. So I think basically looking at the histories of the formation of current societies, I think is one important step in changing it. I agree that you wouldn't want to make necessarily the whole curriculum that, like I mentioned, even with the Henry VIII example, but I think, as I'm imagining, I put myself in, the mind of a British school child, and them, asking themselves. I mean, one of the things I did, for instance, was the Russian Revolution, and in fact, sometimes I tutor students on certain aspects of history, and I can tell that things like the Russian Revolution, etc., although they are interesting to know, perhaps as points of trivia, or if you're interested in history as a general, in general. They don't engage with it as much or as often, because it doesn't really give them a sense or an understanding of who they are and the society in which they live, what that is and how that came to be about, etc.
Well, look, I'm really interested in that, because I think, funnily enough, we are more interested in stories that may not immediately connect to the story of our times. And I'm going to come back to you, if I might. There are just a couple of people I want to bring in, and I'm going to come to you, Kate, in 1 second, because Lizzie Hull asked a question, and I know I said you can't ask questions, but if they're really good and they're very subtle, you can get away with them, Lizzie. And I'm going to come to Lisa G because she said something really clever, but I'm not actually sure what it means. So, Lizzie, why don't you go first, and then I'll come to Lisa in a moment.
Sure. So, just for context, I studied history at undergrad, and I wrote my dissertation on how history tends to be presented in a linear way, as a series of linear achievements that build incrementally upon one another, when in fact you can also see history from circular perspective and many other perspectives. And my question was kind of related to those lines, and it's about histories, about subjective histories as opposed to history, the fact that there are multiple currents of history determined by factors such as who's writing it, and the emphasis they give to certain events, which is, obviously determined by all kinds of factors like class and gender and ethnicity and so forth. And my question was, to what extent have we sort of used this histories bucket, this histories concept, as a way to avoid accountability for just saying, oh, all those other narratives, yeah, they're also history, but they're just histories. To what extent is it actually like a really useful concept for recognizing multiple perspectives? I hope that makes sense, please.
It totally does. And the reason, Lizzie, if I may, I'm going to bring Lisa in too, is because it seems to be these two different elements to a similar question, which is histories as a fudge from an avoidance of accountability. Or Lisa, will you just spell out your point about a need for history to be more, as you say, polyphonic, to have more voices, the histories of more people? Will you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. I mean, for me, it's basically about two things. One is it's about the voices that we hear from now, in which Kate's been doing an amazing thing and giving and really sort of being I think really helpful in that, in the way that she's handed over her Twitter feed over the past week or so, I think. And it's that, and as a corollary, it's about the peoples and the stories that the peoples and the stories that we hear from the past, I think. So it's those two things, which sort of plays very nicely into what Lizzie was just saying about whether the idea of histories is a fudge. I think it's one history of multiple stories told by multiple voices, and so that you're not thinking of it as a linear narrative, you're thinking of it perhaps more as a jigsaw shaped thing, or even a three-dimensional jigsaw or something like that.
We're going to come up with a brilliant Escher painting by the end of this thing, Lisa. Kate, would you weigh on that, and just sort of take us back to the beginning too? Give us your version of what you think the future telling of history should look like.
Well, I think we are in the midst of a history revolution. I mean, let's think about it. 2 weeks ago, it was only 2 weeks ago, wasn't it, that Edward Colston came down, and a statue of a man who everyone in Bristol knew who he was, and so few people outside of Bristol had any idea who Edward Colston was. And suddenly there was interest from all over the world in this man, this slave trader, this evil trader in human souls, and why he was up there. And we've just seen statue after statue being challenged, falling. James Milligan's come down. We're asking questions about Thomas Guy. And we are asking, I think, in these questions, what is history and who tells history? There's always this, ever since I was a child, it's been a truism, hasn't it, that history is written by the victors. And we always think of that in terms of war, but I think we also have to think about that in terms of the victors in life. It's been written by not just those who managed to win the Battle of Hastings, it's also been written on top by a group of people. It's been written by white, upper class, elite, heterosexual men with power. And they are the ones who've written the narrative, who've written the sources. on top of which has become our history. And the statues, became part of the history wars. And I sent a tweet telling off that, you know, Boris, why are you getting involved in this? You know, go and sort out our COVID death rate. The historians will sort out the statues. You know, because statues they're not part of history. They're not a cliff or a mountain, something that's always been there. They're put up by a group of people to tell us who we should venerate. And it's usually a group of elite white men to tell us to venerate another elite white man, normally for reasons of making money. And that's it. Colston was put up, as we know, he was put up 170 years after he died in 1895 by a few, really one man and a few of his friends in Bristol. And the main reason why he was put up, to simplify, is that the working classes were really pushing back in Bristol. They were striking, they were demanding money. And so then you have Colston being put up to remind everyone of the greatness of Bristol. And what really you're seeing there is the racist imperialist narrative being co-opted and sold to the working classes as a way of trying to stop them from demanding more money and demanding rights. So, you know, consistently, in this country, there's been a blurring between history and myth. What is central to us as history is so often the myth, and it's the myth when it comes to the empire, for example, of it being fair, of it being non-oppressive, of it being. We saw, I think, MP Danny Kruger saying this last week. It was fair, it was non-oppressive. We abolished slavery. Yes. No, I'll get into it in a second. And it was voluntarily relinquished. I mean, that's just not the case. I mean, you know, the countries fought tooth and nail not to be oppressed, and then they fought tooth and nail to get their independence. And we know in all kinds of scandals about the Mau Mau what the British government did to try and keep it back. And, you know, the whole question about the abolition of slavery, you know, many countries did it before us. And that's, you know, when we think of the Haitian uprising, the slave revolution of enslaved people there, you know, the British were fighting back just to try and get a bit of the empire. You know, so we are sold this image of history, and it has been very dominated by a certain group. And it's been quite fascinating to me, everyone saying, oh, we can't whip out our history. When, I mean, today is Windrush Day, of course, commemorating with the Windrush people who came here. And, you know, in 2010, all their landing cards were destroyed. All the landing cards were destroyed by the Home Office. And this archive, which, number one, has a complete political purpose because people can use it to prove when they got here. And if they got here before 1971, they have the rights. But also, that aside, it is this incredible historical archive. And it was just thrown in the bin in 2010. Any museum would have taken it. The National Archives, the British Museum, you know, would have taken it. I'd have put it in my bedroom. And we were all taken it. But it was ripped up. And, you know, history is edited, it's torn apart. We're told to venerate certain people. It's reworked. It's constantly revised. And I think in this country, if we're tackling our colonial past, and we have to accept that we have a colonial past in which we raided and looted and oppressed other countries, and we have to accept that much of the startup money, so we put it, in the 18th century city was built on slavery, not just in Bristol, but in Liverpool and in London. Many of our, you know, the houses that we, you know, live in London were bought with money that was eventually generated from the slave trade. So we have to, I think, confront this. And it's not something I think we like to confront in Britain. We have to confront it. And I think that we need to have, just as Lisa was saying, that polyphonic view. We need to have the stories of women, of the working classes, of LGBTQI people, of all the people who've been excluded from the narrative. And often people say, oh, well, I would have that, but there's just no sources. And there's no sources. All we've got are, you know, white, because we've got, you know, any amount of elite white men giving them their memoirs. Oh, we haven't got any sources. But you have, if you dig and you try, and so many, you know, and I think that history is in a revolution, as our many, well, we nearly finished. Sorry, and as our many discourses, we're thinking about the canon in English literature, we're thinking about what elite white men who said what science was and what categorization was. And I think we're in this is a moment, it's a cultural moment that we have to kind of transform into a cultural shift, that from now on, every British child knows what the slavery and the empire, and knows about Windrush, and knows just as much about that as they might know about Catherine of Aragon.
So, Kate, I guess, so I think we can easily kind of dismiss the sources argument, right? I think you're totally right. Let's say the sources are there. So the reason I was trying to interrupt you was that the thing that I find more difficult is, the thing that was really surprising to me about Edward Colston, and it shows my naivety and ignorance about this, was the fact that the statue was put up in the 1890s. And when we looked into, I remember looking into the statues of Confederate soldiers that were put up in the South, that they hadn't been put up just after the Civil War. They'd been put up, you know, around the Voting Rights Act in 1965 rather than 1865. That we venerate certain people at moments that are reflective of our current circumstances, not necessarily statements of history themselves. And so I suppose the question that I've got really is that inevitable? Because what you're describing is a recentering of history, but particularly around some of the things that are dominant and problems today. Is that necessarily a good thing? Should it be the case that we try to come to our history without an attempt to slot it in to the kind of agenda of today's society? Or is that actually what history is there to do? What do you think about that?
I mean, Colston, as I was saying, Colston, yes, was put up in 1895. And the overall reason was to stop the working classes of Bristol from striking. That was the overall reason why he was put up, to kind of tell the working classes of Bristol to venerate this man and really see themselves as part of the great empire, which was based on white supremacy. So they were kind of being given white supremacy as a sop to stop them from demanding things like unemployment benefits and sick leave. So Colston was put up, but really only by one man. When it was put, and no one wants to pay for it. When it was put up, it was only half paid for. It wasn't really. We're often told it was put up by the people of Bristol, and it was put up really by one man who had this vision of a statue. And obviously, any of us can put up a statue in our garden if we were to try and get one up. But and there was recently the Mayor of London and Caroline Criado-Pellis, and a lot of people put their weight behind putting the suffragist Millicent Fawcett in Parliament Square. I think that we are constantly in transition in history, and we are constantly realizing that voices have been excluded. And even 19th century historians, they realized that voices have been excluded. For example, Henry Mayhew went out there and interviewed loads of working class people in Victorian London and asked, how do you live? Because he could see their lives have been excluded. So I think, you know, we're continuously saying, what have we excluded? And I think our society, it's not, yes, we are horrifically stratified. And this is, you know, we only have to look at the cabinet, this is a country of elite white men having power. But it is less than it was in the Victorian time. And I think that it is more democratic in terms of what we want. And people vote with their feet. They watch documentaries, they read articles, they buy books, and that makes it clear what kind of history we want in the popular narrative. You know, one of my colleagues at Reading is working in animal history. And that is, you know, these new areas that we haven't looked at, what you know, the animal rights and animal history is being, Rohan's being excluded. So I think that we can't, I don't think we can say, us looking now at putting up a statue of, say, the great abolitionist Equiano or Joseph Knight, who fought against abolition in Scotland, that's the equivalent of Colston. I think that we can't, I don't think that I see the connection you're making, but I don't think we can say that because we are trying to look at, we're not teaching people to venerate, we're reminding of what histories has been excluded. And I think the work we're doing now in the 21st century is saying what has been left out, and what has been left out of the history of Britain, which has all been about elite white men. And so that's why it's a revolution. There's a long, long way to go. I don't think it's going to be done by the time I'm dead. But I still think that, I'll never die, of course, but I still think that we are, what we're doing is, yes, there are questions of who has power, who's telling the story, who's the one speaking. But I think that the questions that we're looking at now, which are social media, I think is really important in giving all a voice, is saying the excluded now need to be brought to the fore. And I think the polyphony, which Victorian Bristol and Britain was not a polyphony at all, I think that's a future. So I think that, I mean, I'm half on statues myself. I think that, you know, there are other ways of commemorating and venerating, but I do think that we, you know, Equiano should be on a banknote, Equiano should be statues, and Equiano should be, you know, in a picture drawn in every school child's picture, as say Samuel Sharp, the great leader of enslaved rebellions in Jamaica.
Okay, well, Kate, I'd love to come back to that. What should be in these curriculums? I'm going to, Luke, I can see your hands up. If you'll forgive me, I'm just going to bring in a few people who've been waiting, and I'm going to come back to you if I may. I wanted to come to Avi, because Avi was saying that he was working in his dissertation on actually inclusion. Oh, hers, forgive me.
Don't worry.
By the way, how are you going to know? I'm doing this on the fly. So, Avi, forgive me. About inclusion in, is it in history or in history telling? What are you working on?
So I haven't got my marks back yet, but I've been working on my dissertation on the need to include the South Asian diaspora. So focusing on the 18th to 20th century, looking at 3 kind of exceptional case studies, and then arguing based on, you know, like factual research, and then kind of highlighting these notable case studies as the need to like highlight further, you know, examples of notable South Asians, and just in that sort of direction, like highlighting the need for greater inclusion in British historical education.
And can I ask you, forgive me, Abby, when you studied history, having gone through school, so you are at, is it a doctoral dissertation or it's
undergraduate?
Undergrad. So when you, having done, I imagine you did history at school and you're now doing history at university, right? Do you look at it and think, this is just weird what I'm taught in school? It's so distant from the stories that are the stories of my family or the world that interests me. Tell me about what you think of the history you get.
So kind of like harkening back to what was mentioned earlier, yes, suffragettes, Tudors, Russian Revolution, and communist China was on my like A-level GCSE history. And when I came to university, it was only then that I realised, you know, the breadth and depth of different modules and subjects which I wasn't able to acknowledge or access at school. I mean, really just taking it back to basics with, you know, the kind of exclusion of ethnic minority voices in the World Wars, for example. Like, I didn't really have the idea or the magnitude of, you know, like the Indian war effort, for example, of nearly 2 million soldiers in the First World War. And these voices, yes, they might be mentioned as statistics, but factual information or even greater inclusion in textbooks or history curriculums is not supplemented. So this is 2014, 2015 for my GCSEs.
And do you think, Avi, there's a way, and I ask this, I'm slightly leading the witness, forgive me, but I'm really aware of the extent to which there are touchstones in other people's lives that I'm just completely ignorant of, right? And they're historic, and they're not necessarily in my family's history or my family's lens on history. But how do you think we could or should change that in our schools and universities?
So kind of, I'll put a link afterwards, but sort of through my research, I found a report by the Royal Historical Society back from 2018, and they did like a very in-depth report on, you know, the representation within the curriculum, within institutions of higher education for ethnic minority. And though obviously there has been a move to include greater, more globalized histories, there's very much still a systematic problem with very Eurocentric and white-centric, you know, focused national curriculums. And I feel that it's definitely taking it back to basics. It's really, you know, needs to be state-informed change. Yes, we can argue from the grassroots, and I do argue from the grassroots that the need for change, but in order for, you know, like nationwide change to happen, more representation happening, it needs to be from the government themselves saying, okay, we hear you, we need to include, you know, these voices which haven't been included. An example of this, I just listened to a great talk earlier from Anita Anand. She had a talk with the UK Punjabi Heritage Association, highlighting the case of Sophia Dalip Singh, and kind of, sorry to go a bit off tangent, but
oh, it's really good.
So she's one of the case studies or the people that I've mentioned in my dissertation. And for those people who might not know about her, she was actually the granddaughter of the last Sikh emperor. So the person who, the last person who had the Kohinoor diamond before it was taken by Queen Victoria and the British Empire. The goddaughter of Queen Victoria and a suffragette with Emmeline Pankhurst. And it was only until I saw her BBC documentary and then through my own wider reading that I'd, kind of heard about her. And you can kind of see this sort of like narrowing of the lens through recent movies such as the Suffragette movie, I can't remember what year it was published, but released, but kind of not 17. The inclusion of those sorts of voices. Thank you. 2017, kind of not her inclusion in important scenes, kind of just showing that there's a lack of attention or kind of awareness of, notable South Asians or other ethnic minorities in general.
Avi, thanks so much. Yeah, as you were talking, you touched on some really interesting points in the chat. So I'm going to actually bring in some of those people too. I'm going to do things out of order, if I might, just because as you were talking, Alison Navarro was making this interesting point about how you include family histories, these histories that are so real to us, and then give us an understanding of other people's perspective on history. I wonder, Alison, hello, there you are. Alison, will you talk a little bit about what you're talking about and sorry to be practical, but how you would actually do what you're suggesting? Oh, sorry, I think you're muted. Have we got you? Try again. Alison, give it a go. Oh no. Alison, I'm going to see if the mighty Sam Hockley, Sam Hockley, who's basically running this whole show behind the scenes, suggests to me that it might be your headset. It might be worth trying without. Give it a go. Yeah, that's hello. Alison, I'm going to come back to you. Forgive me. I'm going to ask Sam just to message you. I'm going to come back to you. Can I just bring a couple of other people in? Misha, I was struck by something that you said really, really early in the chat about the bias of information. There you are.
So I'm a A-level student, A-level history student, and in our curriculum, there's a little bit of emphasis on sources, but very much the case is that we are told what happened and we don't look very much at the sources. And it just strikes me that when we read the news nowadays, if we look at the Guardian, the Telegraph, just to look at any old event, the Cummings story, for example, we'll know to account for the partisan lean in any reporting, and we'll look at the sources of the newspapers and sort of draw conclusions from it ourselves based on partisan lean that we account for ourselves. And I was wondering just whether the curriculum needs to have a more source heavy sort of balance, so we look more at the sources and teach students to do a lot more of their drawing conclusions for themselves.
Yeah, that's such an interesting idea. I mean, the question is how, of course, the people who construct the curriculum make those judgments on sources, but the idea of it must be right. Let me give Alison another go, just in case this is possibly working. This is going to be one of these things. We're going to
okay, can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you. There you are. Okay, far away.
I've been on Zoom all day with those headphones. I don't know what's happened. Yeah, so I think as Avi was talking, the thing about touchstones. So I'm a Liverpool-born black woman, and my grandfather's from West Africa. My father was a black activist, is a black activist, and so growing up, they're the touchstones for me. So during the 1981 riots, my dad was a community leader, and getting bricks thrown through our family home from the NF was a touchstone. That was a key part of my history, a key part of why in my 50s I'm kind of still passionate and still fighting. And I just think there's something about how do we get the chance to share our experiences as in a way that's a story. So I used to do a lot of quality training with local authorities and communities. And, you know, just asking people a simple question about, can you tell us something about your name? You know, would just deliver a whole range of information about people's backgrounds and stories and events that were important to them. And so you asked me, you know, how do you do that now? So I work in Sutton, in London, and we're just about to start a storytelling project to hear the voices of Black and minority ethnic communities in Sutton, to inform a piece of work that the Sutton Fairness Commission, which I chair, is undertaking in terms of an investigation into BME communities' life experiences in Sutton. We were already doing that before COVID and before the murder of George Floyd, and we agreed that storytelling was the best way of doing that.
And then Alison, I think the thing that is difficult there is then how do you end up with something that's not just a bunch of really disparate voices? How do you make sure that then forms part of the curriculum so that I get to hear those stories? They form part of the school, or like more realistically, my kids at school make sure that that's part of what they learn. How do you think you go to that next step?
So it's about the themes, isn't it? It's about how you take the themes from the stories that people are telling, and how you produce those stories to back up those themes.
Yeah.
We could have taken another approach, which is the data approach, but we know what the data tells us in Sutton, as it does across the country, that the life experiences of BME community members is you know, less positive than the rest of the community. So what we want to hear is a richness of what is that about, and how does that impact on communities. And, you know, some of it's about pulling at heartstrings of people who aren't really interested or haven't been interested.
And can I just put the question to you that I put to Kate, right? Which is, you know, we set up Tortoise as a newsroom, and we very deliberately said at the start, we're going to be obsessed by certain things: our planet, wealth, and therefore inequality, identity, technology, you know, the 100-year life, but living longer. So we know that we're imposing a certain set of choices on the way in which we're looking at the world. Is that okay for history? Do you think we should actually do the same thing with history and say, look, these are the challenges we're facing in the world today. If we really want to understand how we're going to tackle them, we're going to need some history to inform us. So we're going to have to rethink the way we approach our history, and we're not going to be apologetic about it. We're going to do that with a view to the things that are on our minds now. Is that what we need to do?
Absolutely. And I think Kate just articulated that. I mean, absolutely. What are we waiting for?
And you don't fear, I guess that the reason I'm asking you is you don't fear that what happens is, if you like, you, in the way I just did with Abby, you lead the witness, you make history serve certain agendas of today rather than be the kind of journey of exploration that we were always told it could be.
Well, we can't wait, can we? We can't wait for other people to tell. So I can't wait for other people to tell my history, because they're not going to tell it, are they? So the history is going to be the history that Kate articulated, right. which is not history. That history doesn't reflect me, or if it does, it reflects my history, my background in the wrong way.
Okay. Alison, thank you so much. I'm so glad we managed to get you in. I'm going to just come back to Luke, because I've kept him waiting. Luke Pepera, are you there?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Man, thank you very much. What were you going to say?
No, well, I think actually there were a lot of interesting points made by the people who've just spoken, Kate and Avi especially. I think I understand what you're saying about the difficulty in translating this understanding of history into perhaps a curriculum, you know, which students sit an exam about or on. You know, I think that's, again, what the documentaries and the books, you know, the writing of books, the popular histories, the popular documentaries are for. They are for representing all these other voices. I think both studying Henry VIII in school and having a whole, you know, series of documentaries of him might not be necessary. Well, I think, Henry VIII, that's a topic that I think is still important to learn. But the point being that there are certain, the opportunities for telling stories about these kinds, and the chance to tell the stories about these kinds of other histories and represent these other voices, I think should be allowed by you know, media companies, etc., which is perhaps a slightly different kettle of fish to the histories that we seek to tell in the classroom. But then again, you know, doing history, I think, you know, it's about understanding fundamentally. You know, it's about, that is why human beings, sort of speaking anthropologically, write histories and keep histories. I think there is an aspect, of course, of trying to improve self-esteem. How you feel about yourself largely is largely based on how you think of your ancestors and how you think of your past. I think this is one of the things that has affected especially the Black communities, that because the emphasis on history is on slavery and subjugation, a lot of people, and you know, sometimes including Africans themselves, especially African Americans who are sort of right in the middle of it, sometimes I think, you know, have these challenges and issues about self-esteem, representation, etc. And I think if they only knew the deeper history and the people of which they could be proud, etc., it might actually go away in fostering a greater understanding, not only between communities and cultures, but also within that community, within, you know, these sort of Black diaspora diaspora communities in particular. I think another thing which is important to remember when we're talking about the future of history is that in our age of information and knowledge, honesty and the truth about history is going to be key. You can't hide, you know, the events of the past anymore. You can't hide the things that the British did during the empire. You can't hide what, you know, what Columbus did and what the conquistadors did when they went to South America. You know, even today on my thread, which I hope either some of you saw or might go see later, I talked actually about the Arab slave trade, the Indian Ocean slave trade, Africa's forgotten slave trade. And I talked about how certain Swahili chiefs, not all of them, but some of them actually participated in the procuring and trading of slaves. You know, it's not a history which you can hide. You know, it's not something that you can hide anymore. And I think this applies as well to the history of some of these European nations.
Do you think, just out of interest, Luke, one of the things that's happened in the way in which we've thought about science has been that there was a sense, I think, amongst the scientific community for a long period of time that certain sciences were privileged over other sciences. So, for example, you might get, you know, excitement about particular inventions or discoveries, but processes were lost in the telling of these stories. And so actually the scientific community put quite a lot of pressure on getting much more coverage, for example, of earth sciences over just life sciences, that there's been a change in the agenda on science. Do you think that around the media, and I'm thinking here, you know, in the UK, we've got the BBC, but we've also got newspapers, we've got publishers, there should be something that is more concerted from historians like you and Kate to say, look, we look to you in the media, not just in schools, but in the media, to have a broader view of what history covers.
Yes, I mean, that's absolutely correct. And I think in terms of representing these voices and having this broader view, it's not something, I mean, history is such a vast subject, it's not something you can do in a curriculum. It's something that you have to do as part of a culture, as part of society. And the gatekeepers who allow storytellers, who allow people to share their perspectives. I mean, we've seen recent documentaries by David Olusoga, for instance, on a lot of these aspects, and they've been incredibly popular. And I mean, Olusoga, you know, stands tall because there aren't a lot of documentaries, etc., that, you know, look into this kind of history. There are not a lot of books. I mean, someone asked me for book recommendations on one of my threads about, let's say, African Christianity. A lot of people believing that, you know, Christianity was brought that to Africa through the missionaries of the 19th and 20th centuries, when, you know, that's just not true. And when I was looking at it, I said, actually, there's not a lot, because not a lot has been written about this subject, probably because those in, you know, let's say in the executive rooms of the BBC or maybe the publishing rooms, etc., feel that it's not going to be popular. I mean, I understand they want to try and, you know, they're, or some of them, at least the publishers, are running a business, so they're trying to look for the things which they know have an audience and they think will engage interest. And I think one of the fallacies of not representing these voices is that, you know, people believe that they don't have an audience. But I think actually what Kate has been instrumental in showing with her Twitter thread today is that they do. I mean, you know, some of my threads today, again, bowled over by interest, some of the threads of the past week have seen huge levels of audience engagement, which demonstrates there is an appetite for this history.
So I'm going to come back to Kate on that point, which is about, I suppose, sharing the microphone and sharing and moving the spotlight. But before I do that, Kate, if I might, I'm just going to bring in a couple of people. Firstly, I'd quite like to bring in a couple of my colleagues. Firstly, Matt Dancona and then Zav Greenwood on different points. Matt taught history and Zav had a point about not learning anything about local history. But Matt, when you think about this and you're listening to the conversation, what do you think we should do to change the way in which we understand or learn our history?
Well, first of all, there's huge excitement in the air, and that's great. And one of my favourite works of history is E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, which has that wonderful phrase about the need to reclaim forgotten people from, I think he says, the enormous condescensions of posterity, which is a fabulous phrase. So the idea of a polyphonic history is, so important, and the idea that you have to look at history in the round and reclaim those parts of history which have been suppressed, incredibly important. And it's exciting that that's become such a sort of shared project. I do have concerns though, because I think history is a discipline first and foremost, and I think that it's really important that when we teach history, when we study history, we don't see it primarily as a ideological or an ethical undertaking. I think there are two key risks in this area. One is that you, in good faith, but nonetheless, you impose modern values on the past. I was a medievalist, and that can be particularly dangerous in that context. And the second is that you treat the past as if it's simply a sort of overture to the present. And there have been all sorts of schools of history that have fallen into that trap. The Whig interpretation of history, which tried to explain the history of England in terms of slow incremental reform towards inevitable progress. And the more aggressive Marxist version of history, which was a dialectical approach that there was an inevitable shift towards a Marxist endpoint visible in the process of history. And I think that we must always be cautious as we're going down this path, not to fall into either of those traps, because history is not civics any more than it should be patriotic, jingoistic education. It's history. It's about the reclamation of the past. It's not there to make us feel good or bad. And I suppose that may sound a bit severe in the current context where we're sharing a sense of commonality in what's going on with the statues and reclaiming past histories. But I think it's really important that history does not become a subset of something else.
Mm. And Matt, what happens if it's already that, but by default? Right. I mean, just to go back to Kate's original point, that it's a bunch of old white blokes.
Of course. Well, that's why.
And they don't think they say it's not civics,
no.
But of course it's establishment.
No,
civics.
which is why I started really with a very strong statement of support about the notion of reclaiming those parts of history which have been neglected and doing so in an aggressive fashion.
But I guess what I'm saying, what I'm asking you is if you acknowledge the fact that this happens implicitly, right,
yeah,
then why don't we just say, okay, look,
that's the postmodern. The postmodernist would say all history is narrative. It's all from a point of view. It just depends which point of view you decide you're going to back. So you can back the dead white male horse, or you can back the new kind of horse, right? I think that's a craven approach. I think history should be about the pursuit of the truth in all of its glory. Mm-hmm. And I certainly don't think that it should be, part of the historian's task is to be constantly checking not only privilege, but your own ideology, your own assumptions, mm-hmm. and making sure that the process of peer review is genuinely broad. And one of the great things about the internet is that peer review is now not just people in your college and in your immediate academic circle. It can be global, which is excellent. But I don't think we should submit to this idea that all history is biased, therefore let's pick the good one.
Right. Okay. I can get that. But Matt, thank you. I'm going to come to Paula Unger because I've said I would, and I'd love to come to Naomi Sottendorp, but I'm going to bring in Zav just because I'm interested in this point, Zav, about local and not learning anything about where you live. Hey there.
Hi, how's it going? Good. My internet's a bit unstable, so if it goes funny, you can just go off me. Yeah, I mean, it was just kind of a thought which came to mind because I'm from Burnley originally. Burnley's a kind of very strong working class community, very strong community of kind of ex-miners. My family have all kind of, before my generation, or before the generation above me, were all miners. And I do find it unusual that obviously on a national curriculum, there is a national focus to history. I think if you lose the kind of learning you can get about your local community, you're missing out, quite a big part of kind of a phenomenon that can kind of teach you your sense of place, your sense of identity, your sense of community. And I mean, I'm sure people will disagree with me on this, but I didn't find anything particularly helpful about learning, about William the Conqueror about 16 times at school. I would have found it much more interesting to learn about my local community and also to have learned kind of recent history as well. I think if we talk across generations, I think we will realize that we all have massive gaps in our knowledge where, for instance, I knew nothing about the Bosnian Civil War before I went to Bosnia.
Yeah. Well,
for people in their 40s, I'm sure it was, a huge deal at the time, but just by being born too late for it, there was nothing I ever learned about it. And I think it would have helped to know more about these things.
Well, this is, and Zav, this is the point, I think goes to Luke's point right at the beginning, which is actually you're going to find you have much more interest in things that you may not even know that you're interested in. How do you open that up? Listen, thank you. I'm going to do two things. Naomi Sottendorp. Naomi, can I just bring you in, just because you keep saying interesting things, and even though we're running short of time, I don't blame you for that. It's just inconvenient to this conversation. Fire away.
Right, first, my first degree was in ancient history and anthropology, and I was just so delighted to hear what Matt was saying about history as a discipline. And the thing that I wanted to say, as in light of history as a discipline and as a third generation Holocaust survivor, is how uncomfortable I am with all the plans and all the ideas that are around the Holocaust memorial that are being planned for this country. I don't think it's going to help me. On reflection, I think I've been to Berlin for the first time in 1999, and it's a country I go to more than Israel because it is a country in which I can breathe out, because it's a country that treats the Holocaust history and the history of genocide in a sensible way that makes me feel genuinely that this is a city that is determined to learn from history and not do it again. And it's the only place I want to go back to right now with everything that's kicking off in this country. I'm desperate to go to somewhere where there are tripping stones, and where in Germany they wouldn't throw away the Windrush because they would have put it in their archive museum. You'd be able to go and see it, and they would be talking about their impulse to do this, and then their impulse to destroy it, and then their impulse to save it, and you can learn all of that. Last time I was there was an incredible thing there about genocide, Nazism and employment law, and how they would set up employment bureaus. They would take over a town, and then almost the next day they would open the Office of Employment. And I was like, of course, but it was so helpful. Yeah. So for me, and then when I look at, I've just read very briefly over the weekend some of the plans for the Genocide Memorial here, which is not a genocide memorial, it's a Holocaust memorial. And I think it's a way of the Tories or whoever is in power, because I don't think it was suggested, but whoever it is, to say, look, We were wonderful. We saved the Jews. Aren't we great? And please don't ask any questions about any genocide that we may have been involved in, any deaths that we may have caused, any wrongdoing we did, because there was this one time when we were super brilliant and we were absolutely great. And the bad people are over there in Germany, and never forget that. And it's like, that's not helping me. More to the point, I'm also a social worker who does a lot of stuff with trauma-informed practice. This is not helping me process the trauma of the war. It just isn't. It won't help. I will go back to Germany. I will keep going back to Germany. But I would love this country to have a more intelligent and mature discussion about what it is, and where is even the impulse for a Holocaust memorial here, when we have already been involved in so many genocides that we didn't record here. That's it.
Naomi, thank you. I mean, I think to be fair, I think to those people who are involved in that Holocaust memorial, that probably deserves or warrants a thinking, because there are so many views on that, I know, and people I know would have different ones too. I'm just conscious of the time. I'd love to come back to Kate, and Kate, hear from you, having heard all you have, not least what Naomi just said, but what Matt said and Zav before. What do you think you do to do what you've done with Luke, but on a national scale? How do you share? How do you change who the gatekeepers are on storytelling? How do you change who are the characters that we hear, whose stories we hear? What would you do practically to change that?
I think that's exactly the question. That's the gatekeepers, and you often hear women, working classes, ethnic minorities being told to speak up, but it's a case of the gatekeepers being willing to hear their stories, and the gatekeepers tend to be from a certain class, from a certain grouping, and that is similar to the grouping that's written history before. And so some of it is going to be, and we're seeing this incredible pushback now, aren't we? People are talking about Black history, they're talking about Windrush, and we see, all these people are saying, oh, all lives matter, and saying why aren't we, in this pushback, because people are terrified of losing a tiny bit of their privilege, and they don't want to give up even like 5% of their white privilege because of they feel it would be a loss. We see this continually. So I think it is a question of changing the narratives and putting and saying that obviously the problem is in public history is that it's about, just as Luke was saying, what sells. So people will say, oh, the book by a white person sells, so let's just have more books by white people. And we have to sort of change that narrative, and in TV and on movies and throughout the kind of history spectrum. And I think, just briefly going back to what Matt was saying, history events happen. Henry VIII was born on a certain date. The Field of the Cloth of Gold happened on a certain date. And then they are interpreted. And the question of historical truth, I think, is completely fugitive. I think it's almost impossible to find. And it is a question of who controls the narrative. I mean, women's history is more my speciality. And you see a lot in the 20th century saying, oh, women in the medieval period, they kind of laughed off sexual assault. They accepted it was kind of their life. And when you actually go and look at the sources, it's not the case. They didn't laugh it off, and they did find it distressing, and they hated it. It was not seen as part of your life. So, we have to ask who is in control of the narrative. And I think the question is, as you said, it'd always be the question of control and who is in charge of it. But certainly, I think bringing the excluded margins into the centre, I think, is vital. And I think what Naomi was saying about Germany, they do reckon with their history every day. And with the question of Judaism, of course, there were so many Jews that Britain didn't let in. They knew they were being persecuted. It was obviously happening. They weren't allowed in. Anne Frank tried to get to America. Her family weren't allowed in. And we have to reckon with all parts of our history. And I think that the big question now is changing the narrative. And I think people in the average British TV viewer and book reader is saying, that is amazing that, last week we had Reni Eddo-Lodge and Bernardine Evaristo at top of the book selling charts. Why has that never happened before? And I think the narrative is very much changing, as say perhaps it did 20 years ago about women's history being brought into history. And there are so many, and I think that it is, but as you say, the gates have to be opened, and I'm not a gatekeeper, but there are ways in which I can share my platform in the university, in books, contacts with TV and my Twitter feed, which is what I was trying to do. But we kind of need, you know, and this does go right to the top. It's got to go right to the top of the cabinet, of the Prime Minister, and, you know, is the willingness to do it within our political class? I just don't see it.
It's I mean, Kate, by the way, hats off to you on that, on the takeover, because actually it's such a vivid demonstration of how big a change is needed, but also how simple it is in terms of, you know, giving people and changing who those gatekeepers are. So it's a really fascinating thing. And I just want to make sure that we hear, last of all, from Luke. I'm sorry, I've not entirely kept a grip on time, so we've run over by a couple of minutes. But Luke, what to the point that Kate was just making, are your concluding thoughts on this? Where would you like to see things change, particularly around the gatekeepers, the point that she was just making?
Well, I think the gatekeepers need to ask themselves serious questions about what kind of history needs to be represented, and the voices, the different voices that they can bring in. Also, in fact, looking at certain histories and certain stories that have already been told, and actually giving perhaps a certain perspective to them. I mean, there was an interesting point made by Naomi about reckoning with the past and understanding, you know, the being able to go to Berlin and having this breathing space, because there aren't aspects of history which are either not known or hidden, and which have been hidden in the past. But, you know, nowadays it's not easy to do so. So actually, you know, if you did, you know, if for example, there was a TV series on, let's say, you know, certain negative things that happened during, you know, the British Empire, or even, there was actually even one I saw which I found immensely interesting on this other side, to Churchill. I know it's tricky territory because he's revered as a hero, but it talked about how actually Churchill had written a lot of the history about himself, because he had access when the lot of the documents weren't, you know, allowed to be shared, etc. But Churchill, in his capacity previously a prime minister, basically had a lot of access to the secret documents. So he was able to put forward a narrative when he wrote, you know, his autobiography, etc. About this different, and it was actually touched upon in a documentary, this kind of thing. I'd never known about it. And, you know, that actually, I mean, it hasn't changed, you know, all of my perceptions on Churchill. And I still see him as this mixed figure, but these are the kinds of histories we should explore. And, you know, the truths about history's reckoning with the past, confronting the negative things. And it's successful, like Naomi pointed out, and Kate also pointed out, it's successful for places like Germany. It doesn't make a country or a nation weaker or a society weaker. It actually brings people together, you know, reckoning with the past in this way.
Well, Luke, thank you. I mean, that's a brilliant point to end on, because I think the point that Matt made, which was that history's not there to make you feel good or make you feel bad. Exactly the point you were making. It's so funny listening to you and Kate, and the conversation that we've carried on, and forgive me that it's gone on a little longer than planned. I kept being reminded of the fact that when we have these thinkings about technology, when we were discussing data and, you know, surveillance and the world that we live in today, we keep coming back to this same issue, which is who decides? Who decides what data is given up? Who decides who has oversight over these networks? And I wrote down here as listening to you, I was like, who decides? Who decides what's in these curriculums? Who decides what's on television or on the radio? And actually, of course, the answer to the question that we've got before us today is that perfect tension between a history that is not a branch of civics, that's not there trying to deliver some political agenda, but nor one that is negligent of it, nor one that says, oh, well, somehow history will decide for itself what stories are covered and what won't. You know, clearly there needs to be, you know, to use Kate's brilliant phrase, a history revolution, and yours, Luke, is honesty. We'll take away, just so you know, a practical look at the point Misha made about sources and how would you change that. The point that Alison made about deriving something from family histories, real histories, and into themes. Avi's point, you know, which is similar about people and those people's histories, and definitely we'll look into Zav. In fact, I might even ask you, Zav, to do it. Look into place and local history. But I suppose the thing that we come back to, and the one that we'll really focus on then, is this question of the gatekeepers. Who decides, and how is that going to change the future of history? So I hope you feel you've contributed to our thinking a little more deeply and a little more widely about this. A massive thank you to everyone who's joined this evening, but particularly to Luke Pepera and to Professor Kate Williams, to everyone who's here this evening. A big thank you to Liz for trying to marshal and manage the kind of volume of chat that we had. It suggests to me that we probably need more conversations on this, so we'll try and have some future think-ins. One quick flag, we've got this education summit on Thursday. We're talking about whether it's a time for a revolution in our learning, history being one critical part of that. If you can join us for some of all, it's open and it's a proper thinking, please do. But for tonight, please just join me in thanking Luke and Kate with a cheerful wave goodbye. Thank you both.